Well, good morning. It's good to be here. I appreciate Roger not stealing my thunder because the title of the sermon is A Letter to the Church in Las Vegas.
Oh, that's awesome.
Fabulous Sin City. Because it really is. I'm probably going to do an unusual thing or two this morning in terms of sermons preached from this pulpit. Not for me, but for sermons preached from this pulpit. This sermon really is in two parts. First part is background, history. I know that's shocking coming from me, but I was driven a bunch of different ways this week thinking about and researching this, and I'd start on one thing and another rabbit trail would pop up, and I'm going, yeah, but everything I have looked at has opened some new facet of this letter. So I want to share the background and the information about Corinth and the information about the people in Corinth and about the people who are named in this letter. We skip over those names. We know the familiar names, the important names. We know Paul and Timothy and Priscilla and Aquilla, but there's a bunch of other names in here, and those people have their own stories. We just get little glimpses, but they have their own stories, and when you know the stories, you know what we know from other parts of the Bible, it makes this letter much more meaningful. So I'm going to spend half my time just giving you context. And then I'm going to do a rapid overview of all 16 chapters. Everybody, yeah. No, and I promise it's not, I emphasize the word rapid because I'm going to try and get us out of here so we can still beat the Baptists to lunch. Because that's important. Let me pray first. Father, thank you. Thank you for the opportunity we have to come together, to gather, to worship together, to pray together, to sing together, and to study your word together. Thank you for the great privilege that it is. Thank you that you have called us into a community, that you don't call us to live lives of solitude and unconnected and uncertain and uncorrected by our brothers and sisters, that together we learn what it means to live in community, to live in your kingdom, to proclaim your gospel, to put into practice the things that you have taught us, the things that Jesus came and died and left his Spirit to empower us to do. Pray you would open the scriptures to us this morning. Send your Holy Spirit. Help me say things that are helpful. Help me say things that equip everyone to study the word for themselves and to understand it more richly and more deeply. I pray all these things in Jesus' name. Amen. All right, yes, fabulous Sin City. That really is Corinth. There actually was, in the Greek language, you may have heard this before. If you haven't, you should know this. There was a verb made out of the name of the city. To corinthianize. To corinthianize was to live a life of debauchery and sexual immorality. When the Greeks said, oh, he's off Corinthianizing, he was off being rowdy. Not only that, but it was also used as a pejorative. They would talk about Corinthian girls or Corinthian companions. And that was like a woman of the evening in Las Vegas. Corinth was notorious. Corinth, some of you know the story. There's a temple of Aphrodite up on their Acropolis. Athens is not the only city with an Acropolis. Acropolis just means the high city, the Acropolis. So the high city, most Greek cities had a castle, a fortress, a hill. And on the hill, they typically would have a refuge in case the city was attacked and its main walls were breached. That's where everybody would run, and where there would be a garrison and where they would withstand a siege. So Athens had an Acropolis. Corinth had an Acropolis. Athens had 3 temples to Athena. They had Athena in different roles. Corinth, in its Acropolis, had a temple to Aphrodite. And the temple to Aphrodite, as you might expect, that's the same as the Latin god Venus. She is the goddess of love and sexual immorality. And the temple of Aphrodite in Corinth, it's not a huge temple. Their Acropolis is much less impressive than Athens. So they didn't spend all the money on huge temples. But the temple was wealthy. The temple of Aphrodite in Corinth owned 1,000 slaves and a number of pieces of property throughout the city. 1,000 female slaves. 1,000 female slaves who were prostitutes. And they lived in various houses of ill repute throughout the city, and it is based on that largely that the city had its reputation. It was the Las Vegas of the first century. It was a place of great immorality. I also was surprised to discover, you would think that I would know some of these things already by now, and I didn't. Let's skip over this for a second. I'll come back to this chart, I promise. It's my outline of the book. I can't see what slide is up. Okay. It was also in the first century a much more important city than Athens. We think of the ancient world, we think of Rome and Athens and Jerusalem and Alexandria, the four great cities of the ancient world. We think of Athens as the capital of Greece, as it is now in modern times. We think of Athens as the preeminent Greek city in the ancient world. And it had been, but it wasn't in the first century. It had been a preeminent city in the 5th century BC, the great age of Pericles, when the Acropolis and the Parthenon were constructed. But the Greeks had been conquered by the Romans. And when the Romans went through the territory of Greece, they sacked and destroyed Greek cities. They sacked and destroyed both Athens and Corinth. Corinth was refounded and grew to a large, prominent, prosperous city. Again, Athens suffered. Athens was probably a quarter, maybe even only a tenth the size of Corinth. Athens remained kind of a backwater city, almost an abandoned city for most of the period until modern times. It grew, it's now the dominant city in Greece, but it wasn't. It wasn't during the Byzantine Empire, that was Constantinople. It wasn't when it was conquered and sacked by the Arabs and the Turks, it was not a prominent city. Corinth. And Corinth actually, after its refounding by the Romans, Caesar Augustus, the Caesar under whose reign Jesus was born, had selected Corinth as the Roman capital for the province of Greece. So Corinth is the city for Roman Greece. Greece is a part of the Roman Empire. It's a province of the Roman Empire. And Corinth is the capital. And Corinth is notoriously corrupt. Okay, now to the map. Now to Paul in Corinth and why Paul goes there. This also, I think, explains sort of why, when we're looking in Luke's account of Paul's missionary journeys in the book of Acts, when we trace his journey, his second missionary journey, the first one he went up into the cities of Asia Minor, which is also Greek culturally, linguistically, ethnically. The Greeks are on both sides of the Aegean. In the cities of Ionia, Lystra, Derbe, he had founded cities during his first journey. They went across the island of Cyprus, up into Asia Minor. He spends some time preaching, proclaiming the gospel, and founding churches in those cities. He goes off on his second missionary journey after going back to home base in Antioch. He leaves from Jerusalem. He goes back to Asia Minor. He wants to visit those churches that he had founded. And then he gets a call in a dream. God speaks to us in dreams. We talked about this. God often speaks in dreams. Paul has a dream. A young man, Greek, and on the other side of the Aegean, he knows this in the dream, saying, "Come preach the gospel to us." So he does. From Troas, he takes a ship across the Aegean and goes to Philippi and Thessalonica and Berea. He passes through some of those other cities. Some of them are open to hearing the gospel. Some of them are not. He follows the example of when Jesus commissioned his 70. If they receive you, stop and stay there. If they don't receive you, shake the dust off your feet and move on. So Paul finds places that receive him in the north. Now in Berea, there's a little kerfuffle, and he leaves town rapidly. He leaves Timothy and Barnabas behind, actually, because the target of the hostility was Paul himself, and he sails down the Aegean to Athens. He doesn't go overland. He'd been going overland in those northern Greek cities. He sails down to Athens on his own. And Timothy and Barnabas are going to come meet him there later. They're not as well known. They were not the target of the crowd and the hostility. And in Athens, he preaches a very famous sermon on a hill just outside the Acropolis. And let me say something about that. I know this is a rabbit trail, but let's get the dates up here if we can go to the next slide. There we go. Second missionary journey, Acts 16 and 17. We know these dates with certainty because Luke's a very good historian. Luke gives us the names of Roman officials. So we know that he's back in Asia Minor. We know he's in Philippi, Thessalonica, and Berea in 50. We know he preached in Athens in 51 AD. And then he left Athens. He was probably only there for a few weeks. Timothy and Barnabas joined him, and he went to Corinth. Why would he go? Why would he preach once in Athens, and he had a convert or two? There are reports of people who were baptized and interest among the men of Athens who want to hear more. He leaves Athens and he goes to Corinth. And that had always puzzled me until I started digging into first century history this week, and I realized, it's because in 50 AD, Athens is not as important a city as Corinth. Athens is the small town fallen on hard times. It's Rust Belt Greece. It's lost a lot of its population. It's lost its wealth. It's lost its prestige. It doesn't have any official government offices for the Roman Empire. And so Paul, after preaching in Athens, goes to Corinth, and he stays in Corinth for 18 months. And Corinth is a tough missionary field. It's like trying to plant a church in Las Vegas. It's a tough crowd. It's a culturally challenging place. He leaves Corinth in 52 and goes to Ephesus, and he stays in Ephesus for 3 years. Okay, that's the historical background. Next slide. I wanted to go back and look at this. Paul's sermon in Athens. If you're not familiar, I know it's a little bit of a rabbit trail, but not really. This helps us understand how Paul approached his Greek audiences. He's preaching to a Greek Gentile audience in Athens. And he says to them, "Men of Athens, I perceive in all things you are very religious." Because there's dozens of temples to dozens of gods throughout the city of Athens. Interesting hook. And he says, you even have a temple over here to the unknown God. Probably this story is familiar to you, but I found some things out about it this week that were brand new to me that I hadn't known before. Why did Athens have temples to an unknown God? They're actually, it's not because they're just, making sure they cover all the bases. We might have left one out. Let's not have any of them get angry with us by being left out. We'll put one up to the unknown God. When God shows up and says, "Hey, why don't I have a temple?" We can say, "Oh, that one's yours." That's an interesting hypothesis, but it's not the historical basis for it. As it turns out, there's not just one temple to an unknown God in Athens. There are about a half a dozen. And it goes back to a historical incident. In 596 BC, this is 200 years before the great classical age. This is back in the day. It's actually a couple of years before Solon reformed the city of Athens. Oh, this is ancient history in Athens. There was an outbreak of the plague. And nobody understands the plague in ancient times or in medieval times. It's very mysterious. It's very frightening. Nobody knows what causes it. Nobody knows why people are getting sick and dying. Nobody knows what to do to make it stop. We haven't had any experience of that. Yeah. No, I'm not going there. The Athenians send for a famous philosopher, religious teacher, mystical, almost shy. He's known as a healer. Epimenides of Crete. Crete's the largest island in Greece. Epimenides was already famous, and they send to him with a request that he come to Athens and help them put an end to the plague, because he will know how to propitiate the gods. He will know what sacrifices to offer and which god needs to be appeased. Epimenides can figure it out for us. He comes to Athens and he says, bring a flock of sheep to the Areopagus. The Areopagus is like the seat of government. It's where they meet when they got to make political decisions. He says, turn the sheep loose. Some of them are black, some of them are white. That really doesn't figure into the story, but that detail's recorded. He says, and follow them and mark the spot where each sheep lies down, and at that spot, offer sacrifice to the local divinity. The Greeks believed that there were gods associated with places, gods associated with trees and springs and groves of olive trees. So he says, follow the sheep, wherever the sheep lie down, offer a sacrifice to the god of that spot, and the plague ends. And they build altars on those spots to an unknown god. So what Paul saw was one of the places where Epimenides' sheep lay down. And they offer away. Oh, and by the way, the plague ended. So here's a description from a Greek, non-Christian, a pagan philosopher actually, sort of a guy who sort of the Rick Steves of the 200 AD, Diogenes Laertius. Hence, even to this day, altars may be found in different parts of Athens with no name inscribed upon them, which are memorials of this atonement. I think Paul knew those details. I don't think Paul doesn't know why that altar is there, why that temple to the end. Paul knows the story. This was a well-known story in the city of Athens. It marked a historic event that left a deep impression. It gets better. Next slide. Some of you may know, Paul quotes a Greek poet in his sermon. The Greek poet that he quotes is Epimenides. I just found this out. I was this year's old when I found this out this week. He quotes the last line, "In you we live and move and have our being." Even one of your own poets has said this. Well, that's the last line of a stanza. It's a poem by Epimenides. It's a hymn to Zeus. And here's the stanza. They fashioned a tomb for you, holy and high one. Cretans, always liars, evil beasts, idle bellies. But you are not dead. You live and abide forever, for in you we live and move and have our being. And so Epimenides is rebuking the lie of the Cretans who built a tomb for Zeus. God is dead, Zeus is dead. You know, it's an old story. want to get rid of the old gods because you got something new and better. So Epiphanides is saying, but Zeus is not dead. Zeus is immortal. And that's who Paul quotes in the sermon. He's standing up in Athens at the hill of the Areopagus. He's looking at the Athenian crowd. He's saying, you've got an altar over here to an unknown god. Paul knows the story. The Athenians know the story. He says, your poet has even said, in you we live and move and have our being. Let me tell you about that God. It's not the God you think it is. It's not the unknown God. And it's not Zeus. And I was just astonished. Paul quotes Epimenides to the Greeks in Athens and calls attention to the altar to the unknown God, and he ties all those threads together. And the first thing that occurred to me when I read all this and the light bulbs are going off and going, how did Paul know all this? And did Paul grumble as a high school student when he was assigned readings from Greek mythology and the Greek poets? Paul had a classical education. He grows up in Greek culture. He is a Pharisee of the Pharisees. He is a student of the Rabbi Gamaliel, but he is also a classical scholar. He knows the Greek world. He knows Hebrew and he knows Greek. He knows the scriptures and he knows the Greek poets. It's a different picture of Paul. And he uses all of this to connect to his audience. And this fits as he moves on to Corinth, because he's going to take all of those tools, all of his skill as a preacher, as an evangelist, as a proclaimer of the gospel, as someone who understands the culture he's talking to. He's going to use all of that in Corinth for a year and a half to establish a church. Next slide. Back to Corinth. There it is. You see the little red square at the top there, the Greek peninsula. Greece is not just the mainland. We have to reorient our understanding of geography. I grew up in elementary and high school, and the geography I learned was, Italy is this long peninsula that looks like a boot. Greece is the next one over. It's a peninsula. And you get over to Asia Minor. But that misunderstands some important things about Greece. Greece is not the peninsula. Greece is the peninsula and the Aegean Sea and all the 100 islands in it. The Greeks are a seafaring people. And also the coastline of the Aegean on the east side. So Greece is not just the mainland on the left. Greece is everything within that little inset block. And Corinth is the east-west connection between the Western Mediterranean and the Eastern Mediterranean, between the Adriatic and Italy and the Aegean and Asia Minor in the east. You didn't want to sail all the way down around the south and go between Greece and Crete. That's open sea. Certain times of the year it's very dangerous. That's where Paul's ship was blown off course and shipwrecked. If you can stay coastal, if you can go up the Gulf of Corinth and make a crossing right there, there's a canal there now, but there wasn't then, and get to the surrounding Gulf, then you can coast from island to island. You're never out of sight of an island in the Aegean. You can see the next one and sail to it, and you can see the next one and sail to it. You're not out in the open Mediterranean. Because of its geographic location, Corinth is wealthy. Next slide. It's wealthy, and it's the capital of Greece. This is, again, the shocking thing that I just learned. I thought Athens was the capital of Greece. It's not in 50 AD. In 50 AD, Corinth is the capital of Greece, and the Romans don't call it Greece, they call it Achaia. They've actually divided up the peninsula. They have Macedonia, Epirus, and Achaia. And Achaia is Athens, Corinth, and Sparta, and the capital with the Roman governor is Corinth. Emperor Augustus chose Corinth as the capital in 27 BC. It had been the capital then for 77 years when Paul got there. Next slide. So Corinth has geographical advantages. Italy to the, Italy to the easy. No. Italy to the east, Asia to the west. It's prosperous. It's a city of merchants and sailors and Roman officials and has a rich middle class. It's a regional Roman government center. It's a city of religious pluralism. There are temples to the Greek gods. There are temples to the Roman gods. There are temples to the Egyptian gods. Because people from all those cultures come to that city. It's a large city, a rich city, a cosmopolitan, diverse city, and it's a notoriously immoral city. Now, ancient Corinth, the site of ancient Corinth, like the site of ancient Ephesus, is abandoned. They moved after an earthquake in the Middle Ages. They moved down to the coast, and this city was then buried and not uncovered until the 20th century. So we get a real good picture of what the downtown part of Corinth looked like and what the temples looked like. Very few written records from 50 AD, and so we've got two temples that we can identify. The one to Aphrodite up on top of the mountain, and there's one to Apollo down in the city. And then the rest of them, if you actually visit, next slide, better schematic. Oh, it's got a theater and an open air, what's called the Odeon and the amphitheater. That big temple in the center is the temple to Apollo. Just on the other side there, on the left-hand side, is the big open agora marketplace. Oh, hold on, back, yeah, there we go. The other temples, even the local guides and maps and things will say, well, this is temple B, and this is temple C, and this is temple D, and E, and F, and G. They don't know because it was buried for hundreds of years. They've excavated, but they can't figure out what they were. By the way, that agora is an interesting spot. The big open area, there's market stalls. You see the long arcade sort of in the upper left corner there of the map, and then a central raised platform. And the central raised platform there is a rostrum, a place of public assembly and speaking, and where the governor would come to hear publicly cases. The Roman governor would hold court there. It's called, the Greek word for it is bema. And bema is translated in the New Testament as judgment seat. So when you see the judgment seat of Christ, it's the bema of Christ. It's a judgment seat where the local ruler comes and hears cases and makes pronouncements. Paul got drug into the marketplace and charged with a crime before the Roman governor in that spot. Next slide. There's one of the temples of the ancient city, and there's the Acropolis of Corinth. Temple of Aphrodite is up there. That's not where the 1,000 slave prostitutes would be found. That was like the local mob headquarters. That was where the Aphrodite's mafia controlled the illegal sex traffic in the city. They owned slaves, they owned property. Next slide. So Paul comes to Corinth after preaching in Athens, and this is all in one chapter of the book of Acts, chapter 18. First thing that Luke tells us is he found two people there, Aquilla and Priscilla. They were Jewish refugees from Rome. And they were tent makers. Now, how did Jewish refugees from Rome wind up in Corinth? Because it's a big commercial city. There are boats going from Italy to Corinth all the time. It's like if you get on an airplane, you're likely to have to go through O'Hare in Chicago because that's where everything converges. Everything converges in Corinth. They were tent makers, which meant they had steady work from the Roman government. Roman legions are always needing tents. The biggest customer for a tent maker anywhere in the Roman Empire is going to be the Roman government. They're going to buy tents for the legions. Paul was a tent maker as well. Priscilla and Aquilla had already become Christians in Rome. They invite Paul to come and live with them and work with them. And Paul takes them up on the offer and takes up residence in their house. And it says he reasoned in the synagogue every Sabbath. And during the week, he made tents for the Roman army. In the synagogue, he persuaded both Jews and Greeks. When he encountered opposition in the synagogue, he shook the dust off his feet and went next door to the house of justice. It also says that Crispus, ruler of the synagogue, believed and was baptized. Now, you have to picture this situation in your head. Paul's been preaching every Sabbath in the synagogue. And some believe and some don't believe, and some are pretty hostile. And they probably got a lot more hostile when the ruler of the synagogue said, Paul's right. Jesus of Nazareth is the Messiah prophesied in the Old Testament. And there's an uproar. There's division. And so Paul says, okay, fine, I won't trouble you guys anymore, but I'm not going away. I'm going to go start preaching next door. Yeah, that's going to improve relations. And he's in Corinth for 18 months. And at the end of the 18 months, that's when a mob of Jews just have had enough. They drag Paul down. The Roman governor is holding court in the marketplace in the judgment seat. They drag Paul down to the agora, present him and say, this guy, we're accusing him of a crime. The governor goes, what's the crime? He's teaching people to worship God in a way that's not lawful. Yeah, you have to think about the circumstances of this and the irony. The city of Corinth has temples to Greek gods and temples to Roman gods and temples to Egyptian gods and a temple to Aphrodite. And a bunch of Jews had drug a teacher in and say, he's teaching people to worship God in a way that's not lawful. And the Roman governors are like, what in the world are you talking about? Worshiping God in a way that's not lawful? Any way you want to worship God is lawful in Corinth. There's no such thing. And the Roman governor just dismisses it. Says, wait, not hearing the case. You guys sort this out. If he's breaking some Jewish law, fine. You go find a rabbi and settle it. He's not breaking any Roman law. Go away. He dismisses the case. And then it says, the Jews beat Sosthenes, the ruler of the synagogue. And it's not quite clear why. Maybe they felt like he had bungled the case. Maybe they felt like he is the one that dragged Paul down there, and now they're embarrassed, so they beat him instead. Or maybe this Sosthenes is the same Sosthenes who's mentioned later. He succeeded Crispus as ruler of the synagogue, and now he's converted to a follower of Jesus as well. But we don't know why exactly the crowd beat him, but he's ruler of the synagogue, and the crowd beats him in the marketplace, and the governor lets Paul go. By the way, next slide. That's the judgment seat of Gallio in Corinth. I was there. I was there in June. I stood there and I read Acts 18 to my little group of a dozen students and 10 or 15 parents and a couple of other teachers. And we stood and looked out. That's the marketplace. You see the little plaque there, the marketplace off to the left. That's where the governor came out and heard this crowd of people who had drugged Paul down there and said, stop. There is no unlawful way to worship God. Go away. Paul was there. This stuff really happened. Luke, by the way, we know exactly when Gallio was Roman governor in Corinth. That's why we can date Paul's stay there. All right, next side trip. Aquila and Priscilla. This is a fascinating couple. Paul meets them in Corinth. They're Jews. They're from Rome. When Paul leaves Corinth and goes across the Achaia to Ephesus, they went with him. And they founded a church in Ephesus. At the end of his letter to the Corinthians, chapter 16, that's the last chapter, writing from Ephesus, he sends greetings back to Corinth from Aquila and Priscilla, and he says, with the church that is in their house. So they had taken in Paul in Corinth, and most probably there was a church that met in their house in Corinth. They have moved with Paul to Ephesus, and now there's a church in Ephesus meeting in their house. It gets better. When he writes a letter to the Romans, and this is probably some 7 or 8 years later, he writes a letter to the Christians in Rome, which he's never been to, but which he's planning to visit. He writes to let them know, hey, I'm coming to visit you. He says, oh, by the way, greet Priscilla and Aquila, and likewise greet the church that is in their house. They had gone back to Rome. They had left because of a persecution, not of Christians, but a persecution of the Jews by the Emperor Claudius. Now they've gone back to Rome, and of course there's a church meeting in their house. This is the third mention in the third city of a church meeting in the house of Priscilla and Aquila. And I had never put those references together. So they had a church in Corinth, met in their house. They had a church in Ephesus, met in their house. They had a church in Rome that met in their house. Writing to Timothy in Ephesus from Rome, this is probably 62 or 63 AD, Paul sends greeting to Aquila and Priscilla. Apparently they then left Rome and went back to Ephesus. All right. One more name. We laughed about Sosthenes getting beaten instead of Paul. I think it's because he was an ally of Paul and they could beat him, but not Paul, possibly because Paul's a Roman citizen and Sosthenes was not. Sosthenes was a Jew, ruler of the synagogue, and the folks in the synagogue that have tried to bring criminal charges against Paul are unhappy, to say the least, and they don't dare beat Paul. But they beat Sosthenes instead. Well, if you look at 1 Corinthians, I teach this letter to my high school classes every year. And you look at 1 Corinthians 1:1, I asked them, okay, who wrote the letter of 1 Corinthians? And all of my kids, without exception, for 10 years, they've all said, oh, it's written by Paul. I said, wrong. You missed an important detail. The letter to the Corinthians says, Paul, called to be an apostle of Jesus Christ through the will of God, and Sosthenes, our brother. He's the co-writer of the letter. It's not a letter from Paul to the church in Corinth. It's a letter from Paul and Sosthenes, who's now in Ephesus with Paul. Back to the church. Okay, so next slide. General outline of Paul's letters. Grace, I thank God for you. Hold fast to the gospel. For the love of everything holy, stop being stupid. And Timothy says hi. You now have the outline of every letter that Paul wrote. Okay, I told you I'd come back to this chart. So now in just a few minutes, I'm going to give you a quick overview of what these 16 chapters are about, and I promise it's going to be quick. It's about a church in trouble. It's about a church with problems. It's about a church that is suffering disorder and difficulties. And there are sinful conditions in the church that Paul has to speak a word to correct. That's in the first 6 chapters. And then he has some specific questions that they apparently have written him asking his advice about. But it does conclude with a stirring proclamation of the gospel, with a stirring reminder of what the sacrament of communion is all about, and with an underlying theme of, with all of these difficulties, I got the solution for you, and it's in one word: agape. Love. Do everything in love. You don't know how to order your service with all the different people trying to exercise their gifts and things. He says the gifts are important, but love is more important. We talked about this yesterday. Paul says, all of your specific practical questions, I've got some ideas. I'll tell you what I think. But the most important thing is remember love. Remember to put the interests of your brothers and sisters ahead of your own. Don't assert your rights. Yeah, maybe it is lawful for you to do certain things. But would that action be loving? Would it be agape? So, the first and the worst problem, I appeal to you that there be no divisions, that you be united. It's been reported to me there is quarreling among you, and you're choosing up sides and teams. Just stop it. Stop doing that. So, then he says, now, specifically, you have moral disorder, legal disorder, and carnal disorder. Next slide. You're tolerating moral disorder. You have someone in your body who claims to be a Christian who's living in incest. He's married his father's wife. You're tolerating and approving sexual immorality. You should not be tolerating and approving sexual immorality. You need to confront him. And if he won't change, you need to tell him to leave. Next slide. Legal disorder. I've gotten word, this is not in the letter where they're asking his advice. He's just basically saying, before I get to the questions that you sent me, I have some things that I need to talk about you didn't ask about, but I've heard. You're suing each other before the Roman courts? You're dragging, again, you got to get the irony. You're dragging people into the Roman courts because you have a dispute? Is there no one among you who can mediate? Wouldn't it be better if you've been wronged by another brother, another Christian in the church, wouldn't it be better just to accept the wrong? Just let yourself be cheated, rather than to go drag a fellow Christian before a Roman court? Are you people crazy? And Paul knows what he's talking about. The Jews in the synagogue had dragged him down before the Roman governor. He says, why would you guys do that? No, you're tolerating immorality, and there's legal disorder. You're resorting to the Roman courts. That's stupid. For the love of God, please stop being stupid. Third problem. Not only are you tolerating moral disorder, some of you are engaging in moral disorder. Some of you are visiting the slaves of Aphrodite in the houses in Corinth. This is a cultural issue. It's not like it's hidden or hard to find. It's prevalent. It's in every quarter of the city. It's practically on every street corner. And some of you are doing that still. I know, that's what people in Corinth do. I know, you're Corinthianizing because you're Corinthians. Stop. It's not a trivial matter. And he says, here's two words I have for you for how to deal with that. Flee sexual immorality. And remember, you were bought with a price. You are not your own. Follow your heart is terrible advice. follow your heart always will get you in trouble. The heart is deceitfully wicked, and our desires of our heart are disordered. They are not reliable guides to what we ought to be doing. And he says, you don't belong to yourself. You were bought. You are not your own. You cannot follow Christ and do what you want. Flee sexual immorality. Stop being involved with the prostitutes of Aphrodite. More practical matters. Marriage and divorce. It's in chapter 7. Go read it. Liberty and license, food offered to idols. That's in chapters 8, 9, and 10. Go read it. Worship service difficulty. It's disordered and disruptive. That's in chapter 11. Go read it. Your identity and the gifts that you pursue. And some people think you ought to have this gift, and some people want that gift. And people are exercising their gifts without regard to anybody else, and they're disrupting the service. That's in chapter 12. He says, what if your body were entirely composed of just a foot? Or just a hand? If you had only an eye, how would you speak? If you had only an ear, how would you smell anything? He said, the body of Christ is like a body with different parts that have different functions. Can the hand say to the foot, I don't need you. You can't grab anything. The foot's like, really? How are you going to get anywhere? Paul says, you are part of one body. Even though you're different from each other, you have different gifts, you have different skills, you are part of one body. Please remember that. And more important than the gifts is love. This is the chapter that everybody is familiar with from Corinthians. But this puts it in the context of his giving answers to the questions they had sent him. The most important thing, more important than the practical advice, even more important than the serious problems that he talked about first, he said the most important thing is love. And not silly romantic love, but agape, altruistic, self-denying love. And that leads him into, again, a summary proclamation of the gospel, the risen Christ. And then in the end, he gives a final exhortation, and he gives 5 different imperatives, 5 different commands, 5 different Greek verbs. When you want an imperative is, it's where the word emperor comes from. The emperor is the imperator. The emperor is the one who issues commands. Emperor probably should be better translated in English as commander. So Paul issues 5 commands. Watch. Stand fast. Be brave. Be strong. And then again, wrapping it all up. This is his theme from beginning to end. Let all that you do be done with love, agape. He drives home the message of this letter with that final exhortation. Let all that you do be done with love, with an interest in and favoring those around you, your brothers and your sisters and everyone you come in contact with. Oh, I got one final rabbit trail. Stephanas of Corinth. The first person Paul baptized, apparently, in Corinth. He mentions him in the first chapter. He mentions him again in this final little conclusion to the letter, because the Corinthians had not just sent a letter to Paul in Ephesus saying, hey, we got a bunch of questions we want your guidance on. They had sent that letter with 3 of their elders, and Stephanas was one of them. And so in his conclusion, he mentions Stephanas of Corinth. He says, I urge you, brothers, you know that the household of Stephanas were the first converts in Achaia. Achaia is Greece. Achaia is the Roman name for the province of Greece, for the province of Athens, Corinth, and Sparta. You know that the household of Stephanas were the first converts in Greece. and that they have devoted themselves to the service of the saints. And he's come as an elder of your church to visit me and to present the questions. Be subject to such as these, and to every fellow worker and laborer. I rejoice at the coming of Stephanas and Fortunatus and Achaicus, because they have made up for your absence, for they refreshed my spirit as well as yours. Give recognition to such people. He singles out these three elders, these three leaders in the church in Corinth that he had left behind, and said, it made me happy to see them again. And Stephanas has a particular resonance for me because those of you that came to the last lecture I gave about the Bible, the verses in our Bible come from a French printer who adopted as his pen name Stephanas. And I'd never really understood why he picked that name. His name is Robert Estienne, but he picked the pen name Stephanas. He printed 3 Greek Bibles in Paris, and then he had to flee because he was a Protestant, and the French king was arresting and executing Protestants. He fled to Geneva, and he published a 4th Greek New Testament in Geneva, which was the first Bible printed anywhere with verse numbers. And he chose as his pen name Stephanas, and it suddenly this week clicked in my head. I'm going, I know why. Stephanas was the first convert in Greece, and he's publishing the Greek text of the New Testament. So he picks the name Stephanas. That's all I got. I didn't give you a lot of exposition on the text of the letter to the church in Corinth, but I hope I gave you some background that will help you understand what that text means. I hope the next time you read Paul's letter to the church in Corinth, some of these things will resonate with you in a different and a deeper way. So I'll close with Paul's last 2 lines from his letter. The grace of our Lord Jesus Christ be with you. My love be with you all in Christ Jesus. Amen. And we're dismissed.